Mill was reincarnated to another world as the son of a noble with an S-rank magic that can copy other people's powers. There was a man who had a dream of creating the world's best dessert. He spent years honing his skills to compete in the biggest competition. He led his team to create a beautiful phoenix made of sugar, and everyone already thought he had won the competition. Unfortunately, his life was cut short when his own dessert fell on top of him. In his last breath, he started to regret how his life ended. He wanted to fulfill his dreams, but God was unjust. However, God had other plans for him and decided to reincarnate him in another world. He was born as Mill Mortine, the son of a noble general. Despite being a noble, his father always did his best to help his people and taught Mill the importance of being kind to others. At the age of 9, Mill was already trained by his father to become a great swordsman. Despite not being the best and wishing to become a pastry chef, Mill continued to practice and perfect his skills. His father went easy on him, using only one hand, but at the same time, he was rich in his training. He taught Mill that letting go of the sword on a battlefield was equivalent to death. Mill followed his father with dedication, trying to parry each hit while barely swinging his sword. His eyes were filled with determination, but it wasn't with training because, in Mill's mind, the biggest battle was to pick which dessert he was going to do next. Of course, that led him to lose his sword. It's not the same as using a butter knife after training. A person came to report that it was almost time for breakfast, and the general had some reports to go through. The general wanted to hear the reports right there and then. The person delivering the news informed him that their bean harvest was going to be huge, just like Mill promised them. Their territory was always barren, which made it impossible for people to cultivate. Still, Mill used the knowledge from the other world to improve the cultivation and harvesting process of their lands. However, the mood quickly changed when news arrived that 50 bandits were on the loose and headed toward their town. Mill was anxious, knowing the bandits would destroy the fields and ruin his plans of creating desserts. He didn't want bandits to ruin his dreams. His father wanted to know how much they had to prepare. It was only 1 month. His father wanted to gather the villagers and arm them, but Mill knew this was crazy. They would get, at most, 30 men in total to defend the land. If the bandits managed to surround the place, they wouldn't be able to survive in the long term. He heard his father's conversation. They cannot ask for reinforcements because other nearby lords already lost against the bandits. If they managed to send them and win the battle, they could use it to take the land. His father's subordinate noticed it and thought he's starting to feel the responsibility of becoming the future lord. So he suggested using their trump card, Mill. The sanctification ceremony, a ritual that will awaken Mill's magic powers, confused Pa. He had no idea what this meant at the breakfast table. His father made a big announcement to the family. He told them that Mill was going to undergo a sanctification ceremony, similar to the coming-of-age ceremony in their world. Although it's traditionally meant for 13 to 15-year-olds, Mill's father believed he deemed it fit. He already had good enough swordsmanship skills, and he was already very intelligent. Mill's mother was initially upset because she wanted him to have more time as a child, but she eventually came around and helped him prepare for the ceremony. After 3 days, it was finally time to go to the royal capital and complete the ritual. His father then put his hand on his shoulder and started to chant a spell. The air around them was filled with energy, and in a split second, they were teleported to the capital. Mill was fascinated by the sights and all ingredients he could use on his desserts. Despite his curiosity, Mill was reminded by his father that he could only buy anything he wanted if he passed the ceremony. He even discovered a new fruit called bonkas, which had a sour taste. He wanted to buy them and try to grow them in their territory, which impressed his father, who thought Mill wanted to develop the territory and create an army. But, as you can guess, this guy only thinks about making his desserts. When they arrived at the church, they met with the panda priests. His father wanted Mill to perform the sanctification ceremony to get his magical abilities. This ceremony involved both physical and mental challenges. First, they measured the magic power by restraining the person and making them drink a bitter drink. They then left them alone in complete darkness without any senses. Usually, kids start screaming after a few minutes, but Mill was different. He spent the whole time thinking about creating new desserts. His mind was filled with ingredients and recipes his father and panda priest couldn't even believe it. 2 days later, Mill found himself surrounded by golden light particles that got absorbed into his body. His father and the panda priest couldn't even believe in his magic potential. They woke him up and took him to the last part of the ritual. The priest was about to read a scripture, and if Mill had successfully got a magical ability, he would be able to comprehend its meaning. As the panda began to read, Mill suddenly understood the scripture was magic itself. His father noticed that everything went smoothly, and on their way back home, just as promised, they stopped at the market for Mill to pick out his bunkers. 3 weeks had passed, and the entire town was now bracing and making preparations for the upcoming bandit siege. Mill had been assigned to help with the defense preparations, and he was eager to lend a hand. He knew that their army was made up of farmers, making them weak and vulnerable. They needed to come up with a strategy and fast. They created a huge defense wall, filled up the wells, and sealed the small villages. They didn't want the bandits to make a base there. The villagers then were going to hide in the biggest village. Defeat was almost certain. They didn't have enough men, and their food could only last 3 days. Lost in thought, Mill was suddenly interrupted by the arrival of his childhood friends Mark and Lumi, who had come to help him. He instructed them on how to gather rocks that could be used to throw at the bandits, but also warned them to stay away from danger. As Mark and Lumi were collecting the rocks, they suddenly heard a strange sound. It was the band, heading straight for their village. They ran back and alerted the villagers. Panic spread among the villagers, afraid they couldn't stop them. Mill's father stepped in to give his speech. Every villager grew some balls of courage and decided they wouldn't let them take their land. The general knew the bandits were going to strike at night, so he started to design where his men would be. The general went off on horseback to scout the area, allowing them to surprise the bandits and strike first. Meanwhile, Mill was charged with safeguarding the village in the general's absence. He sought out Mark and Lumi to convey the message to signal the attack with fire arrows. Lumi was afraid of potentially harming the general, but Mill remained confident that his father would use them as a guide to come back if he was being chased. The general spotted the resources of the bandits, 70 men, 5 good horses, and some captives from previous villages. It was a good sign that they did not carry many provisions. With his magic abilities, the general went straight into battle, doing his best to decrease the enemy numbers in a quick swoop. A few bandits were down. The bandit leader was smart, giving good instructions and stopping the attack. Without many options, the general decided to retreat instead of attacking again. The bandits saw this as an opportunity and gathered their horses to pursue them. However, they made 2 big miscalculations. The first was that they did not notice the traps set by the villagers. The second was that they never expected the supposedly leaderless village to have the mightiest leader of them all. The general spotted the fire arrows and immediately recognized Mill's plan. Mill was guiding his father to come back while also giving their location to the enemy. His father knew their current location and which path to take to reduce the damage to the fields. As the bandits drew nearer to the village, Mill gave the order to a bunch of kids to launch a full-on attack with slingshots. The bandits never expected to be hit by a mix of fire rocks right on their faces. They began to flee in panic, but the flames consumed them before they could escape. Just a few hours earlier, Mill had gathered all the children and explained the plan. He knew that his father would lead the bandits on a chase, so he created a strategy to attack the bandits from their flank, which was their weak point. By using the children, they were able to outnumber the bandits and use their slingshots to great effect. But the bandit leader didn't give up. He managed to parry the rock and climb up the wall. He quickly killed a farmer and challenged the rest. The peasants surrounded him, but he was more experienced in battle. The leader of the bandits ordered everyone to be killed, and the full-on fight began while the kids still did their best to throw rocks. This annoyed the bandit leader. He ran toward the kids and attacked them. The kids couldn't move their legs, and soon blood was splattered on the floor. Mill managed to push the kid away and got hit in the shoulder. The bandit leader used him as a hostage. Mill saw a dead man lying on the ground and quickly thought he could use him to his advantage. The man had his head burnt from the rocks, and Mill used his magical ability to copy the injury to the other bandits. They too started to feel their heads burning, causing confusion among the bandits and their leader. Mill then used the same spell on the leader, who set him free. The bandit leader couldn't understand what was going on and got hit by a rock. Just as he was about to ask if Mill was a wizard, the confrontation against the bandits finally ended. Pat, dividing the food supplies between the villagers to ensure their sustenance, narrates his story about his reincarnation as the son of a poor noble. His only goal in life is to fill this world with sweets. The guards and villagers were taking care of the restrained bandits, planning to send them to another county. Pat's father wants the noble from that county to claim that they've dealt with the bandits. They will lose the glory, but they need to negotiate first. He at least wants compensation for the battle expenses and losses suffered. Pat's father then starts awarding the training guards and villagers for their bravery with weapons and silver coins. Even Pat's little friends were called up and got rewarded for assisting. Pat, and the two happily walked home, but Pat came running to help them carry the goods. He compliments their work, but they stay humble, claiming that they just threw rocks. Pat is happy that nobody lost their life and that they can return to their usual way. The kids return home to celebrate the victory. Amidst the celebration, Mark and Lumi step outside. Mark wonders what they did to the bandits. Lumi reveals their restraint in the main village shed, and that's when stupid Mark decides to check them out because, as a future Pat retainer, he needs to keep an eye on the bandits. Lumi agrees and follows him. The adults tell them that it's not safe and to go back, but Mark pulls Lumi to the bushes and throws pebbles to distract the adults. They take the chance to get inside the shed, just to get scared by the bandit leader. The leader reveals that Mark now has his sword and asks how he got it. Mark is totally scared, and under the bandit's manipulation, the bandit says that he will die once he gets turned in. So, he wants to teach Mark how to use the full power of his magic sword. Mark remembers that Pat can use magic and wishes to help him more. The bandit tells Mark to draw the sword. Mark follows the instructions, and the bandit compliments him, calling him a natural. Lumi tries to call Mark off, but he ignores her. The bandit frees himself from the ropes and tells Mark to get closer to learn the magic words. It's more a magic kick to the gut, sending the stupid kid flying away. The bandit gets up and stabs Lumi, all because of a stupid greedy kid. Blood starts to flow from her wound, and the bandit escapes on a horse. Lumi is barely managing to survive until Pat arrives. He instructs the guards on how to deal with the injury and asks where the bandit went. He finds out the directions and follows him on his horse. Pat concludes that he can use the anti-bandit traps in the area to his advantage. If he's in a direct confrontation, he can use his magic to copy the wound back to the bandit. He manages to realize that he can copy anything he has ever seen. Meanwhile, Pat's father finds out about what happened, scolds the guards for not stopping Pat, making the decision to save his son. Pat's father is worried that the bandit could have companions waiting and turns the tables. He tells Casserole to stay back to assure the villagers while he uses his magic to find Pat in the forest. Mark is struggling to free himself from the bandit. Suddenly, they fall onto a trap, allowing Pat to catch up to them. The bandit is annoyed because of the trap and prepares to fight. The bandit is aware that Pat's magic can replicate any wound he takes. So, he just wants to finish, pass in a single blow. Pa is constantly pushed back until he gets near Mark. The stupid kid tells Pa to abandon him. At this point, we would, but Pass is different. He will never abandon his friends. The bandit is pretty tired of this and breaks Pa's sword, followed by an attack to cut Pa in half. At this moment, Pass uses his magic. Meanwhile, Fuel is using his magic to scout the area, but the only thing he manages to find is Pa's broken sword. He slowly walks back without knowing how to tell Casserole that he lost his son. Yet, when he gets inside the Casserole's house, he finds Pa sitting on his mother's lap. Fuel is shocked and screams. Casserole explains that Pa got back with Mark a while ago. Fuel doesn't understand how he missed Pa coming back. He even used his magic to scout the area. Pa says that it's complicated. To make it short, Pass explains he simply copied his father's teleportation magic. Everyone is confused. Pa explains his magic can copy what he sees into something. So, he copied his father's magic into his body and teleported out with Mark. Casserole understands the situation but still scolds Pass. He forbids him from revealing that he can use other people's magic or use those spells in public. After calming down, Casserole explains to Fuel that people could aim for Pass. His ability to copy magic makes others target him to turn him into a human weapon. The worst part is that the bandit managed to get away and could reveal its secret. Pa then goes out to meet Mark and reveals that Lumi will survive. Lark is super depressed, but Pass tries to convince him to visit her together. Mark blames himself for not hearing them. If he did, she would never get hurt. Pa tries to comfort him, telling him to apologize. He drags Mark to visit her, but she's quite smiley despite the injury. She reveals that she's okay but isn't allowed to go out and play. Pa then decides to use the kitchen to give Mark and Lumi some time alone. Actually, Pass only cares about the sweet he is going to make while Mark is all gloomy. Depressed stupid boy Pa thinks that he can bring smiles to everyone's face by cooking, so he decides to make his bonka pie. He carefully prepares it to the detail while Mark properly apologizes to Lumi. The mood becomes quite weird between the two until Pass comes back, literally 5 minutes later, with a bonka pie. The two start drooling. They never saw a bonka pie in their lives. Pa explains this is his way to make Lumi feel better and also cheer Mark up. The two start eating it like savages, and Lumi mentions that it makes her feel like she isn't wounded anymore. But Pa has another surprise slice, bonkas and honey. The two kids hate it because the flavor is the opposite of the pie. Pa then pulls out his inner Socrates. He explains that every bonka tastes different, and he needs to find harmony in flavors. Pa compares it to people, explaining that Mark has unique traits and that he will find a way to make those traits shine. The lesson he really wants to give is that failing at something only means that he can learn, work hard, and improve. Mark finally cheers up until Lumi's father steps into the room. This guy literally looks like the Demon Lord, demanding Mark to feel responsible for injuring Lumi. Turns out that he only wants to set up a marriage between the two. Mark ends up flustered and doesn't know how to react. Yet when Lumi is asked about her view, she's like, sure, why not? Mark is still trying to recover, and Lumi gives some bonka pie to her father. Mark notices there's only one last slice remaining and asks about his share. Lumi playfully replies that the husband's assets belong to the wife, so she will take it. Pa then realizes that his theory was true. Sweets bring smiles to faces, but he's only just starting. A month passed after the bandit incident, but there was another problem. Pa met Fuel and Casserole, who told him they're broke. Like me, Fuel initially ignored it because Casserole always claims to be broke. Pa, on the other hand, wants to fix the situation. Casserole explains they had to shut down 2 villages because of the bandits, and now they need to dig out the wells and rebuild the houses again. But they also need provisions for all the villagers, plus the fields need to be repaired, and there's no money for all of this. They were going to get 200 gold pieces for the bandit leader, but Mark's stupid Doroma ruined their chances of getting a reward. Casserole thinks about borrowing money from another noble. However, they won't lend anything. All nearby lands were damaged in the winter, and the bandits also damaged it. Pa questions if they can ask his grandparents for help, but his parents cut ties with their families 15 years ago. Casserole says they didn't even introduce Pa to his grandparents, so it's impossible to ask them for money. He further explains that everyone was against him marrying Pass's mother because their lands were really poor, so they basically decided to run away. Pa returns to his friends who quickly understand the situation. Mark tells him not to hide stuff from them because they could also help. Pa changes the topic and asks about Lumi's recovery. She reveals that she can already go out, but she still feels some pain. Mark questions the possibility of making their fields bigger to cultivate more, but they don't have the time, people, or even the money to do it. Lumi says that Pass could sell his sweets in the city, but he cannot afford the production costs. Mark suggests that Pa could teach magic. Pa asks why he wants to learn magic. Stupid Mark thinks that he will become rich just because he can use magic. Of course, his future wife starts shaming him because he's too stupid to learn it, and even if he does, he will probably set himself on fire. Lumi says that magic could be the key. She tells Pa they could get an idea if he shows them his magic, so he decides to give it a try. Pa tells them to draw something on the ground. Mark draws himself defeating a dragon with magic, while Lumi draws some bonkas. Pa then uses his magic to copy the images into their hands. Lumi tries to rub it off, but it doesn't disappear. Pa explains it's permanent if he uses it on trees or walls, but it disappears in 3 days if he uses it on skin. Lumi then asks if he can do the opposite. Pa is confused. She explains that it would be cool if he could put a picture of a house or someone's face on the ground. Pa realizes this is the answer he was looking for, and immediately storms off to meet his father. Casserole was discussing the situation with Fuel and his wife. They were considering asking for money from her parents, but she isn't sure about it. Suddenly, Pa storms into the room with a plan. They all want to hear it. He asks if his father remembers the time when he mentioned his attempts to arrange a marriage for Josie, Pa's sister, who was already 13 and within the typical marriage age. His father still doesn't understand where Pa is going, but Pa explains that his father can take Josie around to introduce her to other nobles because he can use his teleportation magic. However, some nobles cannot use magic and are forced to attend a royal ball in the capital, but that's an expensive and dangerous trip. Pa says they could sell matchmaking photos. He then uses his magic to make his mother's portrait on a plank of wood. Casserole and Fuel cannot believe it because it's so detailed. His mother looks at it and feels like she's seeing herself in a mirror. Pa's goal is to use this magic to make a picture of nobles who are looking for a marriage partner. Casserole thinks this is a perfect opportunity. They can charge 5 or 10 gold pieces per picture, but it could become even more expensive. Some parents won't care about money if they're able to introduce their kids like this. Fuel mentions there's a risk to expose Pa's magic if they do this. Pa explains they won't be able to hide it forever, and if they do this, people will think his magic is just about making pictures. Casserole decides to test this idea first with Count Retests because he will meet her to talk about the bandits. Casserole and Pa arrive in the city of Retestvale and ask for a meeting with Count Retests. Count Retest is watching from the window, curious if he wants to blame her for not dealing with the bandits. She plans to simply praise Casserole for his achievements and send him off. Pa and his father get inside where they meet Count Briotests. Pa remembers his father giving him a brief introduction to her. She is the eldest daughter of the previous count, but her father passed away in battle. Casserole shows his respects to Brioche, and she mentions how Pa looks like a charming young man. Pa approaches her to show his respects, but he already noticed that she's observing their behavior. She invites them to join her for tea, but Pa is more focused on the cookies. She mentions that this is her land specialty, and that she prepared the best possible tea. Casserole stays polite and praises how famous her tea is, mentioning that the aroma and flavor live up to its reputation. But Pa is still focused on the cookies. He grabs one and tries it, just to find it taste horrible. Brioche doesn't understand because most kids love to receive any kind of sweet. Pa then sips on the tea, just another disappointment. Brioche praises Casserole for not only being excellent in military matters but also for all the agricultural changes he made on his land. She mentions that she would love to learn his secrets and knowledge. That's when Casserole drops the bomb. Most of the changes made to his land are because of Pa's advice. She thinks he's refusing to be acknowledged for his achievements. Brioche tells Pa that he must be proud of having such an amazing father. Casserole and Pa have been waiting for this moment. Since she's talking to Pa, he can unleash his true beast. First, he says that he's proud of his father, but he then counterattacks that his father's land was raided by several hundred bandits. It was so bad that Pa and other kids were forced to join the fight. Ryosh realizes that she made a mistake by allowing a kid to talk about this subject, but Pa attacks again. He mentions that they interrogated the bandits who revealed they had come out of Retestvale. She realizes that Pa is trying to negotiate damages and pretends to be ignorant. Ryosh cannot accept defeat and makes the mistake of asking Pa if they have any proof. Casserole then shows a sword owned by one of the bandits, and that sword was carrying Retest's family crest. Pa attacks again, mentioning Retest men failed to eradicate the bandits, and because of it, Casserole's lands were raided. Pa explains they don't want to cause trouble over this incident, but since they were attacked, they need to be compensated for Retest's failure. She asks if he considers 100 gold pieces appropriate, but Pa replies that it doesn't cover the damages. She reveals that he doesn't seem like a child and ups the compensation to 130, but Pa refuses. She cannot believe she was beaten by a kid and decides to give 150 gold pieces. Pa asks his father's opinion, and they accept the deal. While they sign the contract, Ryosh realizes that Pa is exceptional and realizes that he might be the reason his father's land is prospering. Especially because fathers are the ones who conduct negotiations, but Pa just put her to shame. She still thinks that 150 gold pieces is a small price to pay, considering she could have lost the king's trust. After everything is done, Ryosh reveals she underestimated Pa due to his age. Pa apologizes for the things he said, but he needed to do it. She says he never introduced himself to her, and she follows up on her request. Before leaving, Pa apologizes for not bringing a gift, so he pulls out a piece of cloth and uses his magic. Brioche barely believes that she saw him make a portrait of her in a second. She thanks him for the gift, and Pa says goodbye. Casserole then went to a coming-of-age ceremony of the Duke's Castelset grandson. He congratulates the Duke for his grandson Squall's recent coming-of-age. The Duke then introduces Squall, mentioning he graduated as the top student in the military academy. The young boy nervously salutes Casserole, and the Duke apologizes for his stiffness. He reveals that Squall admires Casserole and was looking forward to meeting his childhood hero. Casserole mentions it's an honor and introduces Pa to the Duke. Pa introduces himself in a relaxed and confident manner, impressing the Duke. He calmly compliments Squall, who bites his tongue due to his nerves. The Duke mentions that, despite being younger, Past looks more mature than his grandson. He also mentions that Pa is already an adult and asks if he awakens magic. Past mentions that he indeed got magic abilities by the grace of God, impressing the Duke, who mentions Casserole's family has been blessed. Past stays calm and humbly replies that he got lucky. The Duke gets curious and asks if Past can demonstrate his magic. Pa accepts and asks if he can borrow a piece of cloth from the butler. He casts his magic, printing the image of a beautiful young girl. The Duke is impressed, but his grandson's heart skips a beat. Pa mentions this is a gift from himself and Margrave of Hubbock, who wanted to introduce his daughter to Squall. The Duke mentions the Margrave couldn't be present and asks if it's truly his daughter. Pa introduces her as Margrave's third daughter named Petra. He explains that he visited their domain with his father's magic and met her. The Margrave is currently stuck in a conflict, and Petra couldn't come to meet Squall, so they decided to introduce her this way. Squall is head over heels for her, mentioning she's cute and pretty. Pa takes this chance to invite him to come to her coming-of-age celebration in the next month. Squall instantly agrees. His grandfather gets mad because Squall is stupid and doesn't recognize this was a marriage proposal. The Duke tries to play it safe and tells Squall to calm down. He then asks how he plans on getting there. Past mentions they can use his father's magic to travel safely. Squall acts like a happy puppy, telling his grandfather that they won't have problems with Casserole's help. The Duke starts regretting, but Past sees a chance. He whispers that the Margrave has been fighting for some years and is getting tired. The Duke gets interested and asks for more information. Past mentions the Margrave wants to stop the battle by using the Duke's military, and for that, he wants to marry his daughter to Squall. Despite only being Past's opinion, the Duke thinks it's a piece of interesting and reliable information. The Duke decides to come along to Petra's celebration while thinking that it may become a good story to tell the king. Squall later comes to Pa, and they become friends. Squall wants another portrait of Petra, a spicier one. Pa ends up agreeing because his goal is to become the matchmaker between the two. A few weeks pass, and winter is getting close. The villagers focus their time on rebuilding their homes. Casserole is satisfied with the current situation, and Pa enters the office. He then turns to his father and gives him the letter they received. Casserole reads the letters from the Duke and Margrave and mentions that their temporary income problem has been resolved. They will be receiving 20,000 pieces of silver because Squall and Petra's engagement has been decided. They will be announcing it during Petra's coming of age. The Margrave will also send 30 gold coins in advance, which Fuel thinks they could use to get some horses. Casserole explains the funds are meant to be used to protect Petra. Pa is initially confused, but his father explains the Margrave requested them to keep her safe during their trip and during the ceremony in the capital. Fuel mentions there are plenty of people who are against the idea of marriage between the two noble families. Casserole thinks the same, mentioning the enemy of the Margrave. Fuel thinks it's okay because they're keeping the engagement a secret, but Pa understands the church search might leak the information. Casserole explains the church is officially a neutral entity, but if paid enough money, they will reveal information. Pa also realizes that they can collect tons of information because they claim to be neutral. Casserole mentions he can protect Petra by himself with his teleportation spell, but it will be hard to teleport her and the guards protecting her to the capital at the same time. Fuel mentions they can recruit mercenaries in the capital, but the enemy could infiltrate. Fuel mentions they should refuse to escort Petra, but Casserole refuses. He mentions this is the best opportunity to gain the trust of both lords, which will create a domino effect for mortals' future development. Pa then suddenly gets the perfect idea to protect Lady Petra, the church. He explains it's an unknown place where only those who go under the sanctification with Petra can go. There, they can prolong the ceremony due to various circumstances. Casserole thinks it's a good idea because most people won't interfere with the church. Fuel says this is a perfect plan to earn that gold and build more houses. The day of Petra's coming of age quickly arrived, and Casserole met the Margrave to escort them. The Lord was impressed that Pa was also going to join them. Casserole mentions that Petra will feel more comfortable with someone around her age. Yet, in reality, Pa is part of their plan. They step inside the carriage and greet Petra and her younger twin sister, Lycoris. He tries to talk to Lycoris, but since she isn't good at communication and replies in a cold manner, Lycoris tries to apologize to Petra, who tries to mediate the situation. But she thinks she's only a bonus. Pa's squiring plan is to head to a local church where they will pretend Petra is going under the sanctification ceremony. They will then teleport to the capital and then protect Petra until the appointed time. They finally arrive at the church. The group decides to ambush them, but everyone steps up to protect the girls. Casserole easily defeats his opponent, but one manages to sneak into the carriage. The two sisters begin to scream, scared for their lives, but Pa steps up to protect the girls with a sword. He takes the fight outside. The girls cannot believe their eyes as they see Pa blocking the opponent's attack. Suddenly, one more tries to attack him from the side, and Licorice tries to warn him. When Pa is about to get hit, Casserole manages to disarm the bandit. Father and son then manage to defeat the bandits, and the Margrave thank them for protecting his daughters. But Casserole tells them to go inside. The girls are still scared, but Pa tries to calm them down. They step inside the church and head to the basement, which Petra notices is a bit far. Licorice seems to be afraid of the dark and calls for her sister, but Pa gently holds her hand. He tells her she's safe because they're there, making the little girl blush. After comforting her, Pa guides her down. This makes her think about Pa, who's younger than her but behaves like an adult. She wanted to catch her sister's hand, but she thinks that Pa is the only one who doesn't compare her with her sister. She has always been indecisive, and she thinks that her sister was chosen as the bride because she's prettier. She doesn't think highly of herself because she feels like she's just an extra after reaching the end of the stairs. Cass guides them inside the room and tells everyone to hold their hands in a single line. They follow his instructions, and Casseroles uses his magic, teleporting them to the church in Bovalia. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, there's this weird guy living in this broken house. He explains to a group of mercenaries that he called them here to do a job for him so he can rebuild the Omnia house. He tells the men that he plans to deal a blow to the Cattlesec family. The mercenaries will do anything for money, so they ask whom they need to kill. The weirdo explains they don't need to kill anyone because their task is to bring a certain woman to him. If they succeed, they will receive 10 pieces of gold. The leader of the group asks if the girl is an aristocrat. The weirdo tells them he wants Petra, and they shouldn't mess it up. Once the group leaves, they talk about how the weirdo is too arrogant. They're curious because this idiot created this whole plan just to become an aristocrat. The group cannot understand the weirdo's intentions and think they will be blamed for taking Petra. The leader explains the weirdo's plan has 2 goals. The first is to destroy the Cattlesec family's reputation, and the second is to claim that he saved her and will become an aristocrat by marrying the girl. This only works because Petra's parents will want to keep their status by protecting her innocence. Back at the church, the Margrave comes and tells Petra that the panda priest is waiting for her to start the ceremony. Casserole then gives Pa an important mission. His job is to accompany Licorice to the reception room until Petra is finished. His father explains Licorice seems a bit tired. Pa then approaches Licorice, mentioning that it's hard to rest in that place. He then says they've prepared a separate room for her to rest. She's hesitant, but he tells her that it's important to rest. While giving his hand, she shyly holds onto it, and he guides her. At the same time, the carriage and guard that will escort Petra arrive at the church, and she leaves with her father after finishing the ceremony inside. Pa is a bit confused because Licorice's main state, instead of going with Petra, is a bit aggressive while explaining she's here to protect Licorice. Pa is initially startled and asks if she can relax. Suddenly, the ground starts shaking, which creates a huge hole in the floor. Licorice and Pa fall into the hole, and Casserole shouts for help. Casserole rushes inside the room to find out what's going on. He examines first the situation and realizes this massive, bottomless pit was created by a mage. He orders fuel to explain the situation to the Margrave, and then jumps into the pit. Meanwhile, Pa awakens and tries to understand what happened. He wonders why he is being held hostage because his family is poor. He then looks at Licorice and realizes they are after her. The mercenary leader tells one of his men to keep an eye on them. Before leaving, he tells Pa that he will kill him if he tries to do something. Without any second thought, he decides that he must protect Licorice. Casserole finally reaches the end of that massive, endless pit and realizes the culprit's already escaped. Licorice finally wakes up, and Pa asks if she understands what's going on. Since she doesn't, Pa explains all he knows and tells her to relax. She was initially worried, but she decides to believe Pa. The guy guarding them says that Pa is trying to show off. Pa looks around and understands that this place belonged to a Duke family that fell 10 years ago. He remembers reading the list of possible threats for Petra's escort and realizes there was only one Duke on that list. It was the Duke of Armenia. He uses his magic to copy the information into a ribbon belt and then copies his father's magic to teleport it to his father. Meanwhile, Casserole returned to the church to see if he can get more information. At that moment, there's a light in the room, and the ribbon appears. Casserole holds it and reads the information, revealing that Pa and Licorice are being held in Armenia's estate. They realize that someone from the former Duke's family is the culprit. Meanwhile, the mercenary leader gets inside the room, angry because he just realized that they got Licorice instead of Petra. He tries to attack her, but Pa uses his magic to teleport next to her, yet he gets punched by the mercenary leader. The other guy is confused, but he asks the leader what's going on. The leader explains they won't get paid because they got the wrong girl, and the engagement announcement is happening right now. Pa then realizes their true intentions, but he doesn't have time to think. The bandits want to kill them to avoid leaving any witnesses. The leader focuses on Petra, but Pa ties himself and uses one of the standby swords to protect her. He knocks the other guy down and tries to confront the leader, who's confused as hell. Licorice is relieved, and Pa mentions he will be with her. Pa steps forward, asking the mercenary leader to surrender, but the bandit refuses, mentioning the battle has just begun. But Pa states this is a checkmate. The bandit realizes that he underestimated Pa because he's just a kid. Casserole rushes through the door a couple of seconds later, yet Pa tells them to worry about Licorice first. The bandit realizes he made a mistake because there is no escape from the room. He decided to keep the captives. But he doesn't want to give up and uses his magic to make a hole and escape. Casserole's at his shoulder and tells him how worried he was. Some knights from the Duke and Margrave family arrive, worried about Licorice. Casserole tells the knights to take her to Hubbock and explain about the situation outside. Pa asks if they found the person behind this mess. Fuel replies that it was a self-proclaimed Duke Omiya who tried to escape through the back. The knights wanted Casserole to also come and report everything to the Duke, so they ordered Fuel to go instead because they had to chase the bandit. They rush inside the manor to see if they can find clues about the escape route. Yet, Pa mentions that he felt like the bandit didn't have much magic left to make it far. They suddenly realize something and return to the room. The bandit gets out of the hole, mentioning he pretended to escape but was simply waiting for them to leave. Casserole prepares himself to take the bandit, but Pa stops him, stating that he will settle things. The bandit thinks he's lucky because he will fight a 9-year-old boy. So, he thinks about taking Pa hostage to escape. He dashes forward with a swing to kill Pa, making Casserole worried about his son. However, the bandit's sword is cut in half. The bandit looks at his broken sword, confused, and Pa uses this chance to knock him down. As the bandit falls, Pa gives him the same advice his father always gave, to never take his eyes off his enemy. Casserole is relieved to see his son safe but wants to know how the bandit's sword broke. Cass explains he copied the cracks in the walls into the sword. Casserole reveals he was initially worried but then calls Pa a cunning kid. 1 month later, Pa and Casserole attend the official engagement banquet. They're both happy that they seem fine after the whole incident. Lord Cattlesec comes to them. Cattlesec asks how he can repay them for taking care of the incident. He then personally thanks Pa, who humbly replies that he did his job as a knight. Casserole talks about Squall, mentioning that he has a man's look in him. Yet, the Duke mentions that he's still stiff and nervous because he fell in love with Petra at first sight. But Pa lets his opinion out, revealing that Squall is already becoming a collected and dependable guy. Cattlesec mentions that he hopes Squall becomes a more reliable guy after getting engaged. The Lord then mentions that he needs to re-evaluate Squall based on Pa's opinion. Pa quickly thanks the Lord and tells the Duke that he wants to talk about something. He mentions something is bothering him about last month's incident. He finds it strange that the culprit had a careful, detailed plan and had prepared a stronghold, but they still failed the most basic thing to get the right targets. He reveals something about their plan was off because they probably had some biased information on Petra. He thinks that there was an informant who could give access to abandoned manors, so Pa thinks a third party was influencing everything for their own purpose. Pa thinks the third party leaked false information and overlooked Amiya's movements in the capital city. The Duke tries to think about who could be, but has no answer. He simply mentions it must be the person who benefits the most, like someone who's hated by the Amiya house and held power after it was destroyed. That person created this whole incident to stop the Amiya family from regaining power again. Cattlesec understands that Pa is hinting that it was him and asks him directly, but Pa plays it out, mentioning the kid's dream about conspiracy stories. The Duke thought Pa was just a kid, but he quickly understands how sharp and smart he is. Casserole tries to make his son stop talking, and Pa changes the topic. He mentions it's hard to grow crops in their territory and that they still need some help. Cattlesec asks if it's money, and Pa replies that it would be a great honor if the Duke gives them some assistance. Cattlesec understands this isn't a request but a threat, especially when Pa says he was about to say hello to the Margrave, and he might accidentally tell him the same theory. Cattlesec panics and agrees to give them assistance. The Margrave joins the conversation and thanks Pa for protecting Licorice. He then mentions that Pa completed his coming-of-age ceremony. Pa confirms it, thinking the Margrave is going to talk about his matchmaking business. Yet, the Margrave mentions that he's sure Pa will become famous and will be flooded with offers from everyone. So he just wants to secure his position. Pa bluntly replies with a yes, sure, yet the Margrave asks him if he's interested in someone. Casserole tries to stop Pa from answering, yet Pa replies he didn't find a good one yet. Hubk asks what Pa thinks about his daughter. Pa is confused because Petra just got engaged, but Hubk reveals he's talking about the one he saved, Licorice. Pa is confused, the Duke laughing, and Casserole face-palming. Hubk explains Licorice likes the idea. Pa nervously replies that he's honored, but believes that Licorice deserves someone better than him because he has a low noble status. Yet, Hubk is annoyed because Pa is refusing Licorice when he said that he would settle down if he found someone good enough. He asks what Pa dislikes about Licorice, making him panic. Pa tries to clarify the situation, and Hubk asks for his decision. Pa freezes and ends up replying that Licorice is a wonderful woman. Hubert gets happy and asks about Casserole's opinion. Casserole knows he cannot refuse, so he approves. Past feels betrayed by his father, and Hubert gathers all the people to announce that Licorice and Pa from now on will be engaged. Pa then realizes he thought he was going to matchmake Licorice's wedding just to be matched instead. Seconds later, Licorice arrives with a big smile and finally summons her courage to thank Pa for saving her. This is the first time he sees her smile, and he starts blushing because he never noticed that she was this beautiful. The Margrave does a toast, mentioning he got a fiancée for both his daughters. Squall shakes Pa's hands, mentioning that from now on they will be brothers. After the party, Pa is watching the sunset, confused about everything. Licorice talks to him and nervously asks if she's good enough for him. He smiles and replies with a yes, mentioning that he's happy about it. She smiles back, mentioning she's also happy. Suddenly, Licorice tells Pa that she prepared something for him. She mentions that she prepared some cookies. He appreciates the color and smell, thinking they must taste delicious. But when he tastes it, he realizes that they're salty as the Pacific Ocean. He notices Licorice anticipating the reply, and he tells her that it tastes delicious, making her smile. You know, just the usual day in a married man's life. But at that moment, Pa decides that he will do everything to protect her. This is the end. See you on the next one, and don't forget to subscribe. When Pastry got back home, he was super happy. He started unpacking some wooden boxes. Marco and Lumi came over to see what was going on. Pastry told them it was help he got from the Duke. Lumi opened one box and got surprised. There was a tree inside. He said it's a special tree called a black locust sapling. They thought Pastry was going to use it for pie, but he explained that these trees can grow even in bad soil and make nectar for honey. That got them all excited about eating honey. But there was a problem. Their land didn't get much rain, and the trees they planted kept dying. So Pastry decided to make a big water tank so they'd always have water. Meanwhile, in the big house, Fudd and Casserole were doing money reports for the village. It was the first time in 20 years that they actually made money. Casserole was happy, thinking about all the good and bad times they went through. Fudd saw how Pastry's tree was a big help since he was born. Casserole agreed and called Pastry a savior. Fudd was happy to hear that and moved on to some more stuff he had to report. Fudd asked if Casserole wanted to hear the good news or the bad news first. Casserole was already feeling good, so he said good news first. The new village they were building already had 40 people who wanted to live there. Most of them were refugees from other villages that got messed up by bandits. Now Casserole wanted to know the bad news. Fudd heard about Pastry's new plan, and he took his 2 buddies to the new spot to do it. Casserole knew they were up to something big without asking permission, so he went to check it out. At the spot, Pastry faced a rocky area and used Strudel's magic he secretly learned to dig. But his first try made a huge shockwave that sent Fudd and Casserole flying. They got back up and praised Pastry for his power. Pastry couldn't help but laugh mischievously. He was excited that the spell worked so well. He saw all the cool things he could do with it and jumped around all happy. Marco and Lumi watched, thinking maybe their future leader had gone a bit crazy. But Pastry didn't waste time. He used the magic to dig a big water tank. They were amazed that he did it all by himself. As they admired his work, Pastry said they'd plant the trees around the tank, collect water. When it rains, and the trees would become water tanks too. It would make the place a spot for lots of different plants and animals. He had this dream of making a sweet land that would attract people. Pastry closed his eyes, all happy, imagining the time. Marco and Lumi told him to open his eyes. When he did, he saw his dad looking pretty mad up on the hill. Pastry started sweating because he knew he was in trouble. They thought the loud noises were big landslides. Casserole gave all three of them a little knock on their heads for being so silly. Some time went by, and Pastry made more water tanks and channels for the villages and fields. The villagers thought he was pretty amazing for doing all that. He went to check if everything was working right when his sister, Josie, showed up with a letter for him. She was with Glassage and said it seemed urgent, so he decided to take it himself. Glassage said he wanted to bring it, but Josie really wanted to do it. She thought it might be from his fiancée, so she wanted to be responsible and give it to him. Pastry turned all red when he grabbed the letter from Josie. He looked worried as he read it. Marco and Lumi sneaked up behind him to see why he looked so unhappy. He said it was a letter from Brioche. She wanted him to come to a tea tasting thing and share his thoughts on their new teas. Everybody was confused about this letter. Pastry was trying to figure out what the Countess was planning. See, word got out about Pastry getting engaged, and Brioche heard about it. She couldn't believe an ordinary knight family like Pastry's was joining an important noble house. Brioche talked about how Casserole made the land better after Pastry was born and how Pastry won their negotiation with her about the bandits. She was sure that Huberek saw Pastry's potential. She also got frustrated with how Kadrasek and Huberek got close to Pastry, so she invited him to the tea thing to try to get on his good side. In the village office, Pastry changed the subject back to why he came. He asked if his dad was here, but Fei said he was still in the royal capital for work. He wasn't around. So Pastry told Fudd about the tea invite from the Brioche. Fei thought it was weird that she wanted only kids to come. Pastry told him he had a feeling she might be up to something. Then, Casserole came back from his trip and already knew about the invitation from the royal capital. Pastry was worried, yet his dad thought they could talk about that later. But for now, he had a surprise. Licorice came into the room, and they both had big smiles and were happy to see each other. His dad said she would be staying with him for a little while because of some stuff that happened. In another place, one of Huberek's retainers tells him that he's worried about sending Licorice to stay with the Mortals. Huberek gets annoyed and thinks Brioche is up to something with his future son-in-law. The helper agrees, saying Brioche is smart and probably knows about Mortal's land and Pastry's potential. Huberek thinks her invite to the tea thing is daring. That's why he sent Licorice, so she can go with Pastry. Even if Brioche tries something, it'll be hard to influence Pastry with his fiancée there. On the day of the tea party, the Countess's castle is full of fancy young nobles from the south. Pastry and Licorice arrive, and Pastry notices the picture he made of the Countess from his first visit. He knows it's there to get his attention. The Countess's retainer welcomes Pastry and says he's been told to be respectful and watch him closely. Pastry thinks they're worried he might cause trouble. He sees this as a chance to show off their land stuff. The helper introduces Pastry and Licorice, and Pastry makes a good impression with his first words. He gives out his hard candy sweets to everyone as a gift. He says they'll go great with the tea, and everyone says they look awesome. People are surprised by how good they taste. They've never had sweets this good. Everybody agrees they make the tea taste even better. Now that Pastry had everyone's attention, he told them he'd love to send more candies through traveling merchants as gifts. But he had a request: no sugar taxes for the merchants. He explained that sugary stuff got taxed a lot, and it wouldn't be fair to tax gifts. The nobles thought it'd be strange to tax gifts, so they agreed. Then, Brioche showed up and heard everything. She thought the idea was interesting and used the excuse of talking about business and private stuff to take Pastry away from Licorice. She reminded him that these things should go through her first. Brioche asked Licorice to wait while they talked about stuff concerning her and the Mortal family. They sat down and she asked Pastry straight up what he wanted. Pastry gave Brioche some of his candies to taste, and just like everyone else, she loved them. He told her he made them from water, sugar, and honey. Then he surprised her by saying he planned to make all these ingredients on his family's land and start mass-producing the candies in 3 years. Hearing this surprised Brioche because their land was not very good for growing stuff. But she knew Pastry was capable. Pastry wanted her support because she had access to a harbor and the talk about taxes was a way to get this meeting. Brioche started to worry about what Pastry was planning. She didn't know where this was going, but she agreed to help with the candies. That made Pastry happy, but she wanted to keep an eye on his plans. Meanwhile, at the party, people couldn't stop talking about Pastry. Brioche's helper tried to make Licorice feel bad by saying Pastry would probably get lots of new admirers from this party. Licorice didn't like the thought of Pastry getting attention from other girls, so she left the situation. The meeting between Pastry and Brioche ended. Pastry was happy because the Countess had great connections, which would help him make lots of hard candies. Brioche tried to bring up his relationship with Licorice, but it seemed like she was trying to ask something else, so Pastry didn't answer. Brioche tried to get him to talk, and just then, Licorice walked in, making the situation really awkward. Pastry tried to call Licorice's name, but he stuttered because Brioche still had a hold on him, and she was smiling like she had a secret plan. Finally, Pastry broke free from Brioche when Licorice ran away, upset. The Countess watched and thought the whole thing was funny as Pastry dashed after Licorice. He caught up to her. He was surprised to hear her apologize. He was about to explain when Licorice told him why she was upset. She heard all the ladies in the Great Hall talking about him and thought he might leave her if someone else liked him too. Pastry told her to relax and not overthink it because he would never do that. Licorice said she wasn't like her sister Petra, who could easily talk to anyone. Petra was bold and everybody liked her. Licorice wished she could be more like her. Pastry said she was just a little quieter than Petra, and that was okay. He liked her the way she was. Pastry said he was sure he'd like her even more as they spent time together. He just asked her to trust him and believe what he said. Pastry asked her to wait a moment and trust him no matter what. Then he said he had to go for a bit and used his dad's magic to disappear. Meanwhile, Brioche was happy because she had caused some trouble between the couple. Pastry came back and gave her a candy apple and told her he made it just for her. He carved a heart shape into the caramel. Licorice took it and took a bite. She was amazed. It tasted so good, and it brought back the happy memories of when they made candy together. Tears of joy ran down her face, but Pastry got worried when he saw them. She told him they were happy tears. She took another bite and couldn't believe how delicious it was. Pastry told her its name, the love apple. This made her blush. He said his feelings for her were strong, and he put all of that into the treat she was enjoying. He really wanted to make her happy and see her smile. She gave him a big smile and thanked him. Pastry was relieved he didn't almost lose her. After the tea ceremony, they returned to the village. Pastry was super tired and just lay on his desk. They poured him a cup of bean tea to help him feel better. When he took a sip, it was just what he needed. They noticed some paper on the desk, and Pastry said it was leftover wrapping paper from the hard candies. His mom helped him wrap them while he told her the story. But when Fudd looked closer, he saw that the paper had a picture of the Countess holding him. He couldn't believe Pa used that picture, but Pastry thought it was payback for the Countess messing with his relationship with Licorice. Somewhere else, Brioche was really mad and smashing things up. She was furious because Pastry had sent candies to all the nobles wrapped in that paper. Now, there were rumors going around that she liked younger guys. Meanwhile, Huberek got a report about the army movement of his neighbor and rival, Luderut. Huberek thought Luderut would make his attack before Huberek's army became stronger with the Duke's help. Reports said Luderut had an army of 30,000 soldiers. Huberek planned to write a letter asking for more troops and send it to the Duke. Back in the village, Pastry was counting all the money they made from selling hard candies and matchmaking photos. They had more than 300 gold coins. Pastry wanted to put the silver coins and 4 of the gold coins into his savings. Fay said that was a lot of money for someone his age, but Pastry explained it was fair for the time he spent making sweets and photos. Fay agreed and said Pastry had made the village a lot of money, so Casserole wouldn't be upset. Pastry wanted to use the money to buy some animals, so he asked Fudd to talk to the merchant and get 100 goats. Fay was surprised because they only needed like 70 or 80. Pastry said he'd bid high and then compromised to get a better price. Fay called his business style dirty. Pastry even wanted the merchant to throw in 3 donkeys, and Fay warned him not to be too tough or the merchant might cry. Pastry explained that goat milk and cheese were important for making sweets. Fay told Pastry that they had tried raising goats in the village's early days. Goats are easy to take care of because they eat almost anything, but the land wasn't good enough back then, so they had to let the goats go find a better place to live. Pastry noticed how much better the land was now, so they could start raising animals again. This would help him get closer to his dream of a land of sweets. Meanwhile, he picked up a pot of syrup and asked Fudd to taste it. They tried it, but thought it was too sweet. Pastry said it was his first try at making sugar and that he planned to make their village famous for making sweets. If he could figure out how to make sugar, he could make lots and lots of candy. Later, he got Marco and Lumi to help with one of their projects. Licorice wondered what they were doing, and Pastry told her they were making a juicer. They show how it worked with a lever. Marco tried to help Lumi reach the handle, but he wasn't strong enough, and they both fell, breaking the device. Pastry thought he had the right idea but needed to make a stronger version with metal. Licorice had an idea and told them about a wine press her family used. It needed 2 people to turn a lever and squeeze out the grape juice. Pastry decided to find a way to get one instead of making his own. He rushed back to talk to Fudd about it, and Licorice was happy to see him so excited. But when Pastry went to their office, Fudd and Casserole looked worried. They told him that a war had started between Huberek and Lutterut. Pastry was really upset because this meant all his plans had to be put on hold. Pastry was lost in thought because of the war, and Licorice noticed. She decided to talk to him about it so they could share their feelings. The couple thought that war was foolish when there could be people making and enjoying delicious sweets, which would make everyone in the world happy. After they cheered each other up, Pastry remembered that he was supposed to receive his goats today. He said he wanted to use the goat's rich and delicious milk to make cheesecake. Licorice said she wanted to try the new dessert, so Pastry told her to have high expectations. Later, in the office, Pastry was a bit annoyed when the merchant who was supposed to sell him the goats came to say that a noble had forced him to sell the goats to someone else. The merchant had no choice because his life was threatened. He apologized to Pastry and his father, and Casserole understood, even thanking the merchant for coming to explain in person. Pastry wanted to know who did this, and it turned out to be Baron Lunsbach, who was known for picking on lower-ranked noble families. Fey suggested they use their connections to a powerful noble family to help, but Casserole said their engagement with House Huberek hadn't been formalized yet, so it might be tough to ask for their help. The Huberek conflict likely caused this problem, as war can affect food security. Casserole couldn't believe it was already affecting them just 3 days after the news came out, suggesting it was a big conflict. All regions are connected by trade, so everyone will be affected. Pastry was getting really worked up, thinking about taking action against Baron Lunsbach for ruining his plans and showing disrespect. Casserole and Fey were confused by his anger and tried to calm him down, but Pastry insisted he was going to march to the Baron and confront him. His father then explained that in times of war, all regions need supplies, especially food. Lunsbach's land is closer to the front lines, so it's natural he needs food urgently. Casserole pointed out that the noble didn't steal the goats but paid a fair price for them. He sympathized with his son but explained that only Pastry was affected by this. Fey told him to accept the reality. Once the conflict was settled, he could negotiate for more goats. Pastry felt sad about the promise he made to Licorice regarding the cheesecake. Fey saw this and revealed that there was a way to get supplies even during wartime, by joining the fight as reinforcements. Pastry figured it out quickly. By doing that, they could prioritize getting supplies. Pastry and Licorice being engaged gave them a reason to side with Huberek. Pastry promised he would get his goats back. As they headed out, Licorice felt anxious, so Pastry's mother turned to confront her. Pastry rode off, silently apologizing to his fiancée for going to the front lines so suddenly. He believed he was doing it for the land of sweets he always dreamed of. Back in the Huberek household, a retainer burst in and reported that Lutterut's main forces were on the march, numbering a little over 10,000, just as their enemy had predicted. Huberek believed he could handle these numbers with his forces. He decided to give Squale his first taste of war by putting him on the frontline defenses. Petra was terrified to hear this, but Squale expressed gratitude for the chance to participate in his first campaign and set out immediately. He assured his wife not to worry and promised to help protect her father's land. At the Lutterut camp, he received a report that his advance unit had arrived near the border and had formed ranks. One of his generals expressed fears as their forces were already showing signs of fatigue. While the Huberek army was steadily growing in numbers, which could be a disadvantage, Lutterut assured him that he had already accounted for that. His real goal was to create a rift between Huberek and the Duke. He anticipated that Huberek would send Squale on his first campaign, but he couldn't risk the Duke's grandson So he planned to place Squale in the safest part of the battlefield for an easy win. This would gain the Duke's gratitude. Littleroot intended to lure Squale out to a place where he could easily finish him off, causing the Duke to lose his air and become furious, cutting ties with Huberek, leaving him isolated. Littleroot imagined the despair on Huberek's face as he planned this scheme. During that time, Squale and his unit moved into position, and he felt a bit nervous on his first deployment. He held a picture of his wife to remind himself of what he was fighting for as they advanced. Meanwhile, Littleroot's men lay in wait for the right moment to ambush him. Pastry and Casserole finally reached the Huberek lands, and the boss welcomed them warmly. Casserole said they came to offer help upon hearing about the attack. Huberek was thankful. Pastry almost slipped up by mentioning his goats, but managed to save himself by saying he was there to aid his fiancée's family. Huberek then took them to the war room to check the battlefield. Pastry noticed the enemy's solid defense, but Casserole found it suspicious upon closer inspection. Something didn't seem right, even though it looked okay at first glance. Pastry saw his father's warrior instincts at work and mentioned that the enemy's defensive formation was strange. They reviewed the positions and realized it was all set up to ambush a unit in an unimportant part of the battlefield. Huberek's face turned to horror when he realized it was Squale's unit. Squale received intel that the enemy would attack from the northeast, so he prepared to confront them at their current location. He got a report that the enemy was spotted in the distance, numbering about 20. The young lord rallied his troops and moved forward, but they didn't find any signs of the enemy. Then came another report that they had fallen into an ambush as the enemy charged from behind, and their numbers were greater than reported. Squale's unit was in a panic, and they lost some soldiers. The young lord tried to stay calm and ordered his troops to head into the forest. Unfortunately, there were also enemy troops in the forest, and their total number was about 105 times greater than what was reported. Squale's lieutenant waited for orders. Squale found himself quickly surrounded, and he became the primary target because he was the one giving orders. Just when things seemed bleak, Glacéage's arrows started to take down the invaders. Casserole also fought his way through the remaining enemies. Squale was amazed to see them coming to his rescue. He heard Pastry's voice, and Pastry was thrilled to see him safe. Pastry told Squale that they had come to help him when they heard about his first deployment. Tears of relief welled up in Squale's eyes as Pastry extended his hand to him. Part 12. Casserole and the group swiftly dealt with the enemy, and they returned with Squale to Huberek's palace. Huberek quickly apologized for putting him in that situation, but Squale was clearly shaken. Casserole tried to lift his spirits because Squale never gave up despite being surrounded. However, Squale knew he would have been in big trouble if Pastry and his father hadn't arrived on time. Huberek revealed that Littleroot had decided to withdraw, and he planned to celebrate. But Squale couldn't shake the feeling of incompetence within himself. He was so traumatized that he refused to spend time with Petra, telling her that he wanted to be alone. Casserole and Huberek thought it was a bit harsh for his first battle, but they believed he needed this experience as someone who would inherit the Duke's army. Petra was really worried about him and wondered what she could do to comfort him. Casserole reminded Pastry that he had comforted Marco when Lumi got injured and entrusted Pastry to help. Pastry was unsure because not even Petra could comfort Squale, but she said that she wanted to see Squale smile again. Those words reminded Pastry of what Licorice had once told him, that people would smile and be happy if they ate sweets. That gave him an idea, and he requested to use the kitchen. In the kitchen, Pastry thought that Squale was blaming himself for his lack of ability and had closed his heart. So, he needed to make a sweet that would have a special meaning to him. Time quickly passed, and the banquet celebration began. Everyone seemed to be blaming Squale for his lack of ability, but Casserole tried to comfort him. Despite experiencing his first battle, Squale felt like he had failed. Huberek even joined the conversation, mentioning how he had also failed in his first battle. However, Squale couldn't shake the guilt and blame he felt for the soldiers he had lost. Pastry suddenly returned from the kitchen and congratulated Huberek for his victory. He then presented his sweet as a gift, immediately catching everyone's attention, including Squale's. He gave the first slice of the pie to Squale, who was curious about it. Squale asked for the name, and Pastry replied that it's tart tatin, especially made for him. Squale tasted it and found it delicious. He asked why Pastry chose to present this recipe. Pastry explained the origin of this sweet, created by the Tatin sisters. He said that tarts are made by baking dough with fruits on them. But one day, the sisters forgot to put the dough on the baking pan and only baked the fruits. The sisters felt they had no choice but to put the tart dough during the baking process. That's the origin of this recipe. He then gave a reality check, explaining this recipe was created after a baking failure. The word failure reminded Squale of the traumatizing events. Yet, Pastry called it a miracle. Squale was confused, but Pastry explained that the sisters could have simply thrown out the fruits and remade the tart again in the right order. But this recipe would have never been born. The sisters refused to let the failure end as a failure. Pastry then mentioned that every time he failed at making sweets, he would remind himself of this recipe. He told Squale that even if he fails, he needs to look ahead and try to move on. However, Squale didn't believe those words because his grandfather always taught him that failing is unforgivable. Petra told him he didn't fail because he promised to her that he would return safely. He countered her, mentioning he only came back because he lost the soldiers who sacrificed their lives. Petra said he should be proud because he's thinking about his fallen comrades instead of becoming arrogant about the victory. He finally accepted her words and thanked her and Pastry with a smile. He promised that he would become stronger and wouldn't let this failure go in vain. Huberak thanked Pastry for helping and decided to reward him with anything he wanted. Pastry quickly asked him for an endless supply of stuff, all related to his sweets. After returning home, Pastry started to unload Huberak's gifts. But his father stayed back to negotiate and get revenge on Lunsbach for literally stealing their goats. Casserole suddenly returned after succeeding in the negotiations and grabbed Pastry's hand, telling him that he needed him. Pastry was confused, but Casserole just said his teleportation wouldn't be enough. So, Pastry needed to copy his magic and teleport the livestock. They returned with 100 goats and 5 war horses that were being delivered to Baron Lunsbach, using the same strategy as he did against them. Meanwhile, Pastry received Huberak's wine press and decided to experiment with it right away. He is suddenly called by his mother and goes to meet her. Turns out, she wants him and Casserole to go to the capital. Licorice received a letter from her father, asking her to go with her sister to the capital. But she doesn't have enough clothes, so she wants them to go to the capital to get her new clothes. Pa quickly accepts it because it's his fiancé's request. But he quickly returns home to make Licorice's awaited cheesecake. This is the end. Subscribe for more recaps.